The rifle shot echoed across the Montana Valley like thunder, sending a flock of ravens exploding from the cottonwood trees that lined Clearwater Creek. Thomas Bolin Patterson crouched behind a fallen log, his weathered hands steady on his Winchester. Despite the chaos erupting around him, 50 yards away, smoke rose from the burning fence posts that had marked the boundary between Patterson land and Blackfoot territory for 3 generations. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not today. Not when he'd ridden out here to propose a truce that might finally end the bloodshed that had claimed too many lives on both sides. But someone had started shooting, and now the fragile peace he'd spent months negotiating was dissolving. In gunpowder and rage, through the haze, he caught sight of her, Ayanna Crowfeather, standing motionless in the middle of the battlefield like an island of calm in a storm of violence. Her long black hair whipped in the wind, and her dark eyes met his across the distance with an intensity that made his breath catch. She raised one hand, palm out, in a gesture that somehow commanded attention from every armed man in the valley. "Enough!" Her voice carried with surprising power for such a small woman. "This ends now, or we all die here today." And in that moment, as gunfire gradually ceased and dozens of angry men slowly lowered their weapons, Thomas Patterson realized that this Blackfoot woman held the key to either saving his family's ranch or watching it burn to the ground. What he didn't know was that she also held a secret that would change everything he thought he knew about honor, loyalty, and the price of peace. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Patterson had been home from Afghanistan for 8 months, but some mornings he still woke up reaching for the M4 carbine that used to lean against his bunk. The phantom weight of body armor pulled at his shoulders as he dressed in the pre-dawn darkness of his childhood bedroom, muscle memory from 2 tours in Kandahar refusing to fade despite the Montana mountain air and the familiar comfort of his father's ranch. The Lazy P Ranch stretched across 12,000 acres of some of the most beautiful country in the northern Rockies. Rolling grassland dotted with cattle gave way to pine-covered foothills that climbed toward snow-capped peaks visible on clear days. It was the kind of landscape that appeared on postcards and tourism brochures, the embodiment of the American West that had shaped 4 generations of Patterson men. But beauty couldn't pay bills or settle debts, and the ranch was hemorrhaging money faster than Thomas could find ways to plug the leaks. His father, Big Jim Patterson, had died of a heart attack while Thomas was overseas, leaving behind a legacy built on handshake deals and honor-based agreements that didn't translate well to modern business realities. The funeral had been held without him. By the time the Army processed his emergency leave and arranged transportation home, Jim Patterson was already buried in the family cemetery on the hill overlooking the main house. Thomas had stood alone at the grave marker, still wearing his desert camouflage uniform, trying to reconcile the larger-than-life figure from his memories with the financial disaster revealed in the estate papers. "Your daddy was a good man," said Clara Hendricks, the ranch foreman's wife who'd helped raise Thomas after his mother died. "But he trusted too easily and planned too little. Left you with a mess that would challenge Solomon himself." The mess was substantial. Unpaid loans secured against ranch property. Equipment purchases financed at rates that suggested desperation rather than sound business planning. Labor contracts that guaranteed wages regardless of cattle prices or market conditions. Most troubling were the ongoing disputes with the Blackfoot Nation over water rights, grazing boundaries, and access to traditional hunting grounds. For 3 generations, the Patterson family had maintained an uneasy coexistence with their Blackfoot neighbors. The boundaries between ranch land and tribal territory were marked more by tradition than legal documents, creating gray areas that had generated conflict since Thomas's great-grandfather first settled in the valley. Small disputes over stray Cattle or fence repairs occasionally flared into larger confrontations, but they'd always been resolved through negotiation between community leaders who respected each other despite their differences. That delicate balance had collapsed during Thomas's deployment. A drought-stressed summer had intensified competition for water and grazing land. Young men on both sides, frustrated by economic hardship and generational grievances, had escalated minor incidents into serious confrontations. Fence cutting led to cattle rustling. Accusations of trespassing became armed standoffs. What had once been manageable disagreements had metastasized into something approaching open warfare. Thomas learned about the escalation through letters from Clara and occasional phone calls when military communications allowed. But the sanitized reports he received overseas hadn't prepared him for the reality of returning to a community divided by suspicion and anger. Former neighbors crossed the street to avoid conversations. Business relationships that had endured for decades were dissolving over political disagreements and cultural misunderstandings. The immediate crisis centered on Clearwater Creek, which flowed through both ranch land and tribal territory before joining the Clark Fork River 20 miles downstream. An unusually dry spring had reduced the creek to a fraction of its normal flow, creating desperate competition for water rights that had never been clearly established in writing. Ranch cattle needed water to survive the summer grazing season. Blackfoot families depended on the creek for domestic use and traditional fishing that provided both sustenance and cultural connection to ancestral practices. Both communities had legitimate claims based on decades of usage, but neither had legal documentation that would resolve the dispute in court. The situation had deteriorated when someone nobody could agree on who had built an unauthorized dam that diverted most of the creek flow toward ranch pastures, leaving tribal lands with barely enough water for basic needs. The Blackfoot Tribal Council had demanded immediate removal of the dam, while ranch families insisted they were only protecting water rights their families had exercised for generations. Thomas had inherited this conflict along with everything else in his father's estate. The ranch's survival depended on maintaining access to Clearwater Creek water, but escalating tensions threatened to explode into violence that would destroy relationships and possibly lives. Young men on both sides were talking openly about armed confrontation, and local law enforcement was overwhelmed by the scope of the dispute. Sheriff Bill Morrison, a friend of the Patterson family for 30 years, had been blunt about the situation during Thomas's first week home. "Your daddy could usually talk sense into folks when tempers got hot," he explained over coffee in the ranch kitchen. "But you've been gone for 2 years, and these young hothead don't know you from Adam. They see a soldier coming home to claim his inheritance, and they figure you're just another entitled white boy who thinks military service gives him the right to tell everybody else how to live." The assessment stung because it contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. Thomas had changed during his deployment, hardened by experiences that couldn't be easily explained to civilians who'd never faced hostile fire or watched friends die from improvised explosive devices. The patient diplomacy his father had practiced seemed inadequate for dealing with problems that military training suggested could be solved through superior firepower and tactical advantage. But Afghanistan had also taught him about the futility of trying to solve complex cultural conflicts through violence. He'd seen entire villages destroyed by misunderstandings between American forces and local tribal leaders who shared legitimate grievances but lacked common ground for negotiation. The parallels between those overseas conflicts and the situation developing in his own backyard were impossible to ignore. The ranch's financial situation made compromise essential regardless of personal preferences. Legal fees for a protracted water rights dispute would bankrupt the operation within months. Insurance costs were already climbing as providers reassessed coverage for properties involved in ongoing conflicts. Most critically, the uncertainty was affecting cattle prices as buyers questioned whether the ranch could guarantee consistent operations Thomas spent his first month home studying the historical documents in his father's files, trying to understand how previous generations had navigated similar challenges. What he discovered was a pattern of informal agreements, based on mutual respect and shared recognition, that both communities needed to coexist successfully. His great-grandfather, Samuel Patterson, had negotiated grazing arrangements that allowed tribal members to hunt on ranch land during specific seasons in exchange for assistance with cattle drives and predator control. His grandfather had provided veterinary services to tribal livestock during disease outbreaks, building relationships that transcended cultural boundaries. His father had employed Blackfoot ranch hands who brought specialized knowledge about local weather patterns and animal behavior. Each generation had found ways to turn potential conflicts into mutually beneficial partnerships, but those relationships had been built slowly through personal connections that couldn't be inherited, along with land titles and debt obligations. Thomas was starting from scratch with a community that viewed him as an outsider despite his family's century-long presence in the valley. The turning point came during a town meeting called to address the escalating tensions. Thomas had expected a formal discussion about water rights and boundary disputes. Instead, he found himself in a church basement filled with angry voices and accusations that had been building for months. "The Patterson family thinks they own this entire valley," declared Robert Crow Dog, a Blackfoot tribal council member whose own grandfather had worked cattle with Thomas's great-grandfather. 4 generations of taking whatever they wanted and calling it progress. Maybe it's time to remind them that this was our land long before their ancestors showed up with their papers and their fences. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, not because they were unfair, but because they contained enough historical truth to make denial impossible. The Patterson Ranch had been built on land purchased from the federal government at prices that reflected political power rather than legitimate negotiation with original inhabitants. Every acre of grazing land, every mile of fence line, every water right claimed by his family existed because of legal frameworks that had systematically excluded Blackfoot voices from decision-making processes. But acknowledging historical injustices didn't solve contemporary problems. The ranch provided employment for 30 families, contributed significantly to the local tax base, and represented an investment of 4 generations of labor and sacrifice. Abandoning it wouldn't correct past wrongs, but would create new hardships for people who'd built their lives around the operation's continued success. Thomas stood up slowly, aware that every eye in the room was focused on him. Military training had taught him to project confidence even when facing uncertain situations, but this required a different kind of courage. He was about to stake his family's future on his ability to find common ground with people who had legitimate reasons to distrust everything he represented. "Robert's right about the history," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet room. "My family built our ranch on land that belonged to yours first. That's a fact we can't change, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend otherwise. But what we can change is how we move forward from here." He paused, studying the faces around him, ranchers who'd known his father, tribal members who remembered playing with him as children, young people on both sides who saw this conflict as a test of their generation's willingness to fight for their principles. "The creek is running low because we're in a drought that's affecting everybody. Fighting over water rights won't create more water, but it might destroy the relationships we need to survive until the rains come back. I'm proposing we work together to find solutions that keep both our communities alive instead of letting this dispute kill us all." The response was immediate and polarized. Some voices expressed cautious support for dialogue and negotiation. Others dismissed any talk of cooperation as weakness or betrayal of generational grievances that demanded stronger responses. But one voice rose above the rest with surprising authority. "The soldier speaks wisdom, but words without action are just noise that frightens children and annoys elders." Thomas turned toward the speaker and felt his breath catch. The woman who had spoken was probably in her late 20s, with long black hair braided with small pieces of turquoise and silver. Her dark eyes held his gaze with steady confidence that suggested she was accustomed to being heard when she chose to speak. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a work shirt, but carried herself with the kind of natural dignity that commanded respect without demanding it. "I'm Ayanna Crowfeather," she continued, rising from her seat near the back of the room. "Granddaughter of Joseph Crowfeather, who knew your grandfather and spoke of him with respect despite their disagreements about land and cattle and the price of progress." Thomas felt something shift in the room's atmosphere as Ayanna spoke. The angry voices that had dominated the meeting grew quiet, and even the most vocal opponents of cooperation seemed willing to listen to what she had to say. "My grandfather told stories about the old agreements, when Patterson men and Blackfoot families worked together during harsh winters and drought years, when sharing meant survival for everyone, and pride was less important than making sure children had enough to eat." She paused, her gaze moving around the room to include everyone present. "Those days didn't end because our people stopped needing each other. They ended because we forgot how to trust each other. Maybe it's time to remember." The meeting continued for another hour, but Thomas found himself unable to focus on the procedural discussions about forming committees and scheduling future negotiations. His attention kept returning to Ayanna Crowfeather, who participated in the conversations with insights that revealed deep understanding of both the practical and cultural dimensions of the water dispute. She wasn't just another tribal member with grievances against the Patterson family. She was someone who understood the complexity of the situation and seemed genuinely interested in finding solutions that could work for everyone involved. More than that, she was someone who commanded respect from people on both sides of the divide, suggesting she might be the key to building the coalition necessary for lasting peace. As the meeting ended and people began filing out of the church basement, Thomas found himself walking beside Ayanna toward the parking lot. The evening air was cool and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above the mountains. "Thank you for speaking up in there," he said, unsure how to begin a conversation that might determine his family's future. "Your grandfather's stories about cooperation, do you think that's still possible?" Ayanna stopped walking and turned to face him directly. In the parking lot lighting, he could see that her eyes held depths he hadn't noticed during the meeting, as if she were assessing him for qualities that went beyond his words or his family's reputation. "My grandfather also told stories about Patterson men who kept their promises and Blackfoot leaders who honored their agreements," she said. "But those stories are old, and trust that takes generations to build can be destroyed in a single season of bad choices." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "The question isn't whether cooperation is possible. The question is whether you're the kind of man who can honor the promises he makes, even when keeping them costs more than he expected to pay." Thomas felt the weight of her assessment, recognizing that this moment might be the most important conversation of his life. Everything he'd inherited, the ranch, the debts, the conflicts, the responsibilities to his family and his community, seemed to balance on his ability to prove he was worthy of the trust she might be willing to offer. "I guess we'll both find out," he said finally, "but I'm willing to try if you are." Ayanna studied his face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then we talk again tomorrow. But not here, where everyone is watching and taking sides. Come to the creek at sunrise, where my grandfather and yours used to meet when they needed to solve problems that affected both their families." As she walked away toward a pickup truck with tribal license plates, Thomas realized that he'd just committed himself to negotiations that would determine whether his family's ranch survived or failed. But more than that, he'd begun a relationship with a woman who seemed to understand both the stakes involved and the price that might be required to achieve lasting peace. Tomorrow, at Clearwater Creek, he would discover whether Ayanna Crowfeather could help him save his family's legacy, or whether the secrets she carried would change everything he thought he knew about honor, loyalty, and the true cost of ending a generations-old feud. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas arrived at Clearwater Creek while the morning mist still clung to the water's surface like ghostly fingers. The disputed dam was visible 50 yards upstream, a crude construction of logs and stones that had reduced the creek's flow to barely a trickle on the tribal side. Even in the early light, he could see how dramatically the water level had dropped since his childhood, when the creek had been deep enough for swimming and wide enough to require a running jump to cross. He'd been awake since 3 a.m., unable to sleep after the previous night's meeting. His mind kept replaying Ayanna's final words about promises and their cost, wondering what she might know about his family's history that he didn't, the ranch records. Going back to his great-grandfather's time were incomplete, filled with gaps that might hide agreements or understandings that had never been formally documented. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him turn toward the tribal side of the creek. Ayanna emerged from the cottonwood grove, riding a paint horse that moved with the fluid grace of an animal perfectly attuned to its rider. She wore traditional Blackfoot clothing, a beaded leather shirt and long skirt that seemed to belong to the landscape in a way that made Thomas suddenly conscious of his own modern ranch clothes. "You came," she said, dismounting near the water's edge. "My grandfather said Patterson men could be trusted to keep their word, but I wasn't certain his stories applied to the current generation. Your grandfather knew mine personally?" "They were friends," Ayanna replied, tethering her horse to a fallen log. "Unlikely friends, perhaps, but friends nonetheless. Joseph Crowfeather and Samuel Patterson met here every month for 20 years to discuss problems before they became conflicts. When the railroad wanted to run tracks through both our lands, they worked together to negotiate terms that protected our interests. When the mining company tried to pollute the upper creek, they organized resistance that saved the water for both communities." Thomas felt a strange mix of pride and sadness hearing about a partnership he'd never known existed. "Why didn't my father continue the meetings?" "Because your grandfather died in the Korean War, and the friendship died with him," Ayanna said simply. "James Patterson was a good man, but he was never comfortable with relationships that crossed cultural boundaries. He preferred formal agreements to personal connections, contracts to conversations." She walked to the creek's edge and knelt beside the shallow water, cupping it in her hands before letting it flow between her fingers. "This creek has been the heart of every conflict between our peoples for 60 years. Your family needs it for cattle. Mine needs it for ceremony, for fishing, for the practical business of staying alive. But the creek doesn't belong to either of us. It belongs to itself, and we're just temporary guardians." Thomas joined her beside the water, noting how the morning light seemed to gather around her in ways that made the surrounding landscape more vivid and alive. "So how do we become better guardians?" "By understanding what we're really fighting about," Ayanna said, rising and brushing dust from her skirt. "The dam isn't the problem. The drought isn't the problem. The problem is fear, your people's fear of losing what they've built, my people's fear of losing what little we have left." She gestured toward the disputed dam. "That was built by Bobby Ironcloud and 3 of his friends, angry young men who wanted to make a statement about Blackfoot rights. They didn't have permission from the tribal council, didn't consult with elders, didn't think about consequences beyond proving they couldn't be pushed around." Thomas was surprised by her frankness. "You're telling me the tribal council didn't authorize the dam?" "The tribal council didn't know about it until your ranch hands found it and assumed it was official tribal policy. By then, Bobby and his friends were bragging about outsmarting the white ranchers, and council members felt pressured to support an action they'd never approved. The revelation changed Thomas's understanding of the entire conflict. He'd assumed the dam represented deliberate tribal policy designed to pressure the ranch into concessions. Learning that it had been built by unauthorized individuals who'd put their own community in a difficult position suggested possibilities for resolution that hadn't existed before. What would it take to get the dam removed? He asked. An agreement that addresses the underlying water access issues without making either side look weak or defeated, Ayanna replied. Bobby and his friends need to save face while backing down from a position they should never have taken. The tribal council needs a solution that protects our water rights without encouraging future unauthorized actions. Thomas studied her profile as she spoke, noting the careful way she balanced competing interests while searching for common ground. She wasn't just intelligent. She was politically sophisticated in ways that suggested experience with complex negotiations. "What's your role in the tribal government?" he asked. "I'm not an official anything," Ayanna said with a slight smile. "But I grew up listening to my grandfather's stories about cooperation and conflict resolution. When problems arise that require delicate handling, people sometimes ask for my advice." "And what advice would you give about resolving the situation?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from the disputed dam to the ranch buildings visible in the distance. Then back to Thomas's face. "That depends on whether you're serious about finding solutions, or just looking for ways to get what you want while appearing reasonable." The challenge in her words was unmistakable, but it was delivered without hostility. She was testing him, trying to determine whether he could be trusted with information that might make him vulnerable if he proved unworthy of her confidence. "Try me," Thomas said. "What would a real solution look like?" A real solution would address water access for both communities during drought years, establish clear protocols for future disputes, and create economic opportunities that give young people alternatives to activism born from frustration and boredom. She paused, then continued with increased intensity. "But a real solution would also require acknowledging historical injustices that your family has benefited from, and making concrete commitments to repair relationships that 3 generations of neglect have damaged." Thomas felt the weight of her words, recognizing that she was outlining terms that went far beyond simple water rights negotiations. She was talking about fundamental changes in how the ranch related to the broader community, commitments that would affect every aspect of the operation's future. "What kind of concrete commitments?" "Employment preferences for tribal members in ranch operations, educational partnerships that provide training in modern agricultural techniques while respecting traditional ecological knowledge, revenue sharing, arrangements for tourism or hunting that benefits both communities." The scope of what she was suggesting was staggering. It would transform the ranch from a family operation into something approaching a joint venture with the tribal community. Such arrangements might resolve current conflicts, but would also create new complexities and dependencies that could affect the operation for generations. "Those are significant changes," Thomas said carefully. "They would require approval from people beyond just me." "Of course. But they would also create the kind of foundation that could support lasting peace instead of temporary truces that collapse when the next crisis develops." Ayanna's horse nickered softly, drawing her attention to something moving through the trees on the tribal side of the creek. 3 riders emerged from the cottonwood grove, and Thomas recognized Bobby Ironcloud from previous encounters at community meetings. The young man's expression was hostile as he approached, clearly unhappy to find Ayanna in conversation with a Patterson. "Ayanna, what are you doing here with him?" Bobby demanded, dismounting with aggressive energy. "The council said no unauthorized meetings with ranch people." "The council said no unauthorized negotiations," Ayanna corrected calmly. "I'm not negotiating anything. I'm listening to what he has to say about resolving the water situation." Bobby's two companions flanked him in a way that suggested they'd come prepared for confrontation rather than conversation. Thomas recognized the dynamic from Afghanistan: young men looking for opportunities to prove their courage and commitment, viewing compromise as weakness and dialogue as betrayal. "Nothing he says matters unless he's ready to remove that dam and restore full water flow to our side," Bobby declared. "His family has been stealing our water for 60 years. Time to pay it back with interest." Thomas felt his own military training asserting itself, tactical awareness sharpening as he assessed the potential for violence. 3 young men, probably armed, definitely angry, positioned in ways that could quickly surround him if they chose. Escalation over conversation. But Ayanna stepped between them with surprising authority, her voice carrying the kind of command, presence that demanded attention. "Bobby Ironcloud, you built that dam without permission and created this crisis without consulting anyone who has to live with the consequences. Don't compound your mistakes by threatening violence against someone who came here to find peaceful solutions." The rebuke was delivered with enough force to make Bobby step back, clearly uncomfortable with being challenged in front of his friends. He's a Patterson. His family's history doesn't change the fact that we need to resolve this situation without bloodshed, Ayanna interrupted. "Unless you're prepared to explain to your grandmother why her fishing spots dried up because you started a war instead of finding ways to share the water." The reference to Bobby's grandmother seemed to deflate some of his aggressive posturing. Thomas had heard enough about Blackfoot culture to understand that elder women held positions of respect that made their approval essential for young men seeking status within the community. "What's he offering?" Bobby asked reluctantly. Thomas realized that this moment would determine whether the morning's conversation could lead to meaningful negotiations or would collapse into another failed attempt at community dialogue. Ayanna's eyes met his with an expression that seemed to say everything depended on his next words. "I'm offering to work with the tribal council to develop a comprehensive water management plan that guarantees access for both communities during drought years," Thomas said, choosing his words carefully. "I'm also offering to discuss employment opportunities, educational partnerships, and revenue-sharing arrangements that benefit everyone." Bobby's expression shifted from hostility to skepticism. "What kind of employment opportunities?" "Ranch work, obviously, but also tourism development, hunting guide services, agricultural education programs. The ranch has been operating below capacity because we can't afford full staffing. Partnerships that provide reliable labor while creating training opportunities could benefit both sides." One of Bobby's companions, a quiet young man Thomas didn't recognize, spoke for the first time. "You talking about real jobs with real wages, or make work programs designed to keep us busy and grateful?" The question revealed a sophistication that surprised Thomas. These weren't just angry young men looking for trouble. They were people who understood the difference between meaningful opportunities and tokenism designed to diffuse tensions without addressing underlying problems. "Real jobs," Thomas said. "The ranch needs experienced hands for cattle operations, equipment maintenance, fence repair, seasonal work during calving and roundup. We also need people who understand local ecology, weather patterns, and animal behavior. Traditional knowledge combined with modern techniques." Ayanna had been listening to the exchange with close attention, and Thomas could see her evaluating both his words and Bobby's reactions. "The council meets tomorrow night," she said finally. "If you're serious about comprehensive negotiations, you should present your proposals formally." "I'll be there," Thomas confirmed. "But I'd like to continue these conversations beforehand. There are details that need to be worked out before any formal presentation." Bobby looked uncomfortable with the idea of ongoing dialogue, but didn't object when Ayanna nodded agreement. "We meet here again tomorrow morning, same time. And Bobby, you bring the council's authorization for removal of the unauthorized dam." This crisis ends now, before it destroys relationships we'll need for whatever comes next. As the three young men rode away, Thomas found himself alone with Ayanna beside the creek that had become the symbol of conflict between their communities. The morning mist had burned off, revealing a landscape of stunning beauty marred by human disputes over resources that seemed abundant to anyone who hadn't lived through drought years or economic hardship. "You handled that well," Ayanna observed. "Bobby was looking for an excuse to escalate the situation, and you didn't give him one." "Military training," Thomas replied. "De-escalation techniques for dealing with hostile populations. Though I never expected to use them in my own backyard. Afghanistan, 2 tours. Kandahar province mostly. Working with tribal leaders who had their own reasons to distrust Americans, bearing gifts and promises of cooperation." Ayanna studied his face with new interest. "Did you learn anything there that might apply to our situation here?" Thomas considered the question seriously, thinking about the parallels between overseas conflicts and the tensions developing in his own community. "I learned that most fights aren't really about the things people say they're fighting about. Surface disputes usually mask deeper grievances that won't be resolved through tactical victories or negotiated settlements." "And what are the deeper grievances here?" "Fear," Thomas said, echoing her earlier assessment. "Your people's fear that cooperation with whites always leads to exploitation and loss. My people's fear that acknowledging historical injustices means accepting responsibility for problems they didn't create." Ayanna nodded slowly. "Those are real fears, based on real historical experiences. Overcoming them will require more than good intentions and carefully worded agreements." "What will it require?" "Trust built through actions rather than words. Commitments that cost both sides something valuable, so everyone knows the stakes are real." She paused, her gaze moving across the landscape toward the ranch buildings. "And probably a demonstration that cooperation produces better results than conflict for everyone involved." As they prepared to part ways, Thomas realized that the morning's conversation had shifted his understanding of both the immediate crisis and the broader relationship between their communities. Ayanna wasn't just another tribal member with grievances against his family. She was someone who understood the complexity of the situation and seemed genuinely committed to finding solutions that could work for everyone. More than that, she was someone who commanded respect from both sides of the dispute, making her potentially the most important ally he could hope to find in his efforts to save the ranch and establish lasting peace. "Thank you for coming this morning," he said, as she prepared to mount her horse, "and for trusting me with information that could be used against your community if I were the wrong kind of person." Ayanna paused in the act of gathering her reins, studying his face with an intensity that seemed to look beyond his words to assess his character and intentions. "My grandfather said the measure of a man isn't whether he keeps his promises when it's easy, but whether he keeps them when it costs more than he expected to pay." "And what did he think about my grandfather in that regard?" "He said Samuel Patterson was the kind of man who would honor his word even if it bankrupted him." She mounted her horse with fluid grace, then looked down at him from the saddle. "The question is whether his great-grandson inherited that quality along with his debts and his problems." As she rode away toward the tribal lands, Thomas remained beside the creek, thinking about promises and their cost, about the weight of inherited responsibility and the possibility of building something better than what previous generations had left behind. Tomorrow's meeting with the tribal council would determine whether his family's ranch survived or failed. But this morning's conversation had planted the seeds of something that might grow into genuine partnership if both sides proved willing to pay the price that lasting peace required. The Blackfoot Nation Community Center buzzed with an energy that made Thomas's skin crawl with familiar anxiety. He'd felt this same tension before in village meeting halls in Afghanistan, where tribal elders gathered to decide whether American soldiers were allies or enemies. The weight of collective judgment, the careful assessment of words and gestures, the knowledge that a single misstep could transform negotiation into conflict. Thomas sat in the back row of folding chairs, watching as tribal council members filed into their positions at a long table covered with traditional blankets. Each member wore a mixture of contemporary and traditional clothing, business suits, paired with silver jewelry, modern eyeglasses alongside eagle feathers and beadwork that spoke of cultural heritage, maintained despite decades of pressure to assimilate. The council chamber itself reflected this same blending of worlds. Fluorescent lighting illuminated walls decorated with both contemporary, tribal administration charts and historical photographs of chiefs and warriors from the reservation's early years. An American flag shared space with a Blackfoot Nation banner, creating a visual reminder of the complex political relationships that governed every aspect of tribal life. Ayanna entered through a side door, no longer wearing the traditional clothing from their creekside meetings, but dressed in dark slacks and a white blouse that marked her as someone who moved comfortably between cultural worlds. She carried a leather folder that Thomas suspected contained detailed proposals based on their morning conversations, though she hadn't shared the specifics of what she planned to present. Council Chairman William Standing Bear called the meeting to order with a combination of English and Blackfoot that reminded everyone present of the cultural significance of the proceedings. Thomas had researched the man's background after learning about tonight's meeting. A Harvard-educated attorney who'd returned to the reservation 15 years earlier to help his people navigate federal regulations and treaty obligations while maintaining traditional governance structures. We're here tonight to address the water crisis that threatens both our community and our neighbors at the Patterson Ranch. Standing Bear began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to balancing competing interests. Before we hear proposals for resolution, we need to acknowledge the actions that created this situation. Bobby Ironcloud stood from his seat near the front of the room, his discomfort obvious as dozens of eyes focused on him. Council Chairman, I take responsibility for building the dam without authorization. My friends and I were frustrated by years of watching our water flow to ranch cattle while our own families conserved every drop during drought season. Standing Bear's expression remained neutral, but Thomas could sense the displeasure radiating from other council members. Bobby, your frustration doesn't justify actions that put our entire community at risk. Building unauthorized structures on disputed land could have triggered federal intervention that would have made our situation far worse. I understand that now, Bobby replied, his voice barely audible. I'm prepared to remove the dam if the council orders it. The council does order it, Standing Bear said firmly. But removal alone won't solve the underlying problems that caused you to build it in the first place. That's why we're here tonight, to find lasting solutions instead of temporary fixes. The chairman's gaze moved to Thomas, who felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with being the focus of hostile attention. Mr. Patterson, you requested this meeting to present proposals for resolving the water dispute. The council is prepared to listen, but we expect specific commitments, not vague promises about cooperation and mutual benefit. Thomas stood slowly, aware that every word he spoke would be weighed for evidence of sincerity or manipulation. Military briefings had taught him to present information clearly and concisely, but this audience required a different approach, one that acknowledged emotional and cultural dimensions alongside practical considerations. Chairman Standing Bear, council members, thank you for this opportunity to address issues that affect both our communities, he began. I want to start by acknowledging what Bobby said about frustration and water access. His actions were unauthorized, but his concerns about fair distribution during drought years are legitimate. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Thomas had begun by validating Blackfoot grievances rather than defending ranch interests, a tactical choice that seemed to catch many listeners off guard. The Patterson Ranch has operated for 4 generations, based on water rights that were established without meaningful consultation with the original inhabitants of this land. That historical injustice can't be undone, but it can be addressed through agreements that benefit everyone going forward. Thomas outlined the proposals he discussed with Ayanna: shared water management during drought years, employment opportunities for tribal members, educational partnerships that combine traditional ecological knowledge with modern ranching techniques, and revenue sharing for tourism and hunting operations. But as he spoke, he could see skepticism growing on several council members' faces. These weren't desperate people who would accept any offer that promised short-term relief. They were sophisticated negotiators who understood that vague commitments often concealed hidden conditions that became apparent only after agreements were signed. Council member Margaret Crow Dog raised her hand to interrupt. "Mr. Patterson, your proposals sound generous in theory, but we need specifics. How many jobs are you offering? What percentage of tourism revenue would be shared? Who controls decision-making in these partnerships?" The questions Thomas had been dreading. He'd hoped to establish goodwill through general principles, before getting into details that might reveal the financial constraints limiting his ability to make generous offers. But Margaret was forcing him to show his cards before the game had properly begun. The ranch currently employs 30 people full-time and another 20 during seasonal operations. Thomas replied carefully, "We're prepared to commit that 25% of new hires will be tribal members, with preference given to candidates who complete our training programs." 25% of new hires, repeated Council Member David Two Bears. "How many new hires are you planning?" Thomas felt sweat gathering on his forehead despite the evening chill. "That depends on the ranch's financial performance, which has been affected by the ongoing water dispute and uncertainty about future operations." The evasion was transparent, and he could see several council members exchanging glances that suggested they recognized his limitations. Margaret Crow Dog leaned forward in her chair, her expression sharp with the kind of legal thinking that had made her a successful advocate for tribal rights. "Mr. Patterson, it sounds like you're offering to share opportunities that don't yet exist, funded by profits you're not currently making, dependent on solving problems that your proposals don't actually address. What exactly are you bringing to this negotiation besides good intentions?" The challenge was direct and devastating. Thomas realized that he'd walked into a room full of people who understood exactly how desperate his situation was, who knew that his proposals were limited by financial constraints he couldn't afford to admit publicly before he could respond. Ayanna stood from her seat near the council table. "Chairman Standing Bear, if I may address the council?" Standing Bear nodded, and Thomas watched with a mixture of relief and apprehension as Ayanna moved to the front of the room. She opened her leather folder and spread several documents across the table where council members could examine them. "Mr. Patterson's proposals are constrained by the ranch's current financial situation, which council members have correctly identified," she said, with the kind of directness that cut through diplomatic language. "But those constraints could be addressed through partnerships that provide capital investment while creating genuine opportunities for both communities." She gestured to the documents she distributed. "I've been researching federal programs that provide funding for cooperative agricultural ventures between tribal nations and neighboring ranching operations. The USDA Rural Development Program offers grants and low-interest loans for projects that demonstrate environmental sustainability and community partnership." Thomas stared at the papers, recognizing financial projections and grant application summaries that represented hours of research he hadn't known Ayanna was conducting. She'd apparently been preparing for this meeting far more thoroughly than their conversations had suggested. These programs could provide up to $2 million in development funding for projects that meet federal criteria for environmental impact, community benefit, and economic sustainability, Ayanna continued. "A joint venture between the Patterson ranch in the Blackfoot Nation would qualify for the highest funding levels. Margaret Crow Dog examined the documents with obvious interest. What kind of joint venture are you proposing? A formal partnership that combines ranching operations with cultural tourism, traditional ecological restoration, and educational programming, Ayanna replied. The ranch provides land and operational expertise. The tribal nation provides cultural knowledge, labor force development, and access to federal funding streams available only to tribal partnerships. The scope of what she was suggesting took Thomas's breath away. This wasn't just cooperation on water rights or employment preferences. It was a fundamental transformation of how the ranch operated, creating legal and financial partnerships that would affect every aspect of the business for generations. Standing Bear studied the financial projections with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to distrust proposals that seemed too good to be true. Miss Crow Feather, these programs require extensive documentation, environmental impact studies, and federal approval processes that can take years to complete. What happens to our water crisis while we're waiting for bureaucrats to process applications? The applications would demonstrate our commitment to long-term partnership, which could justify immediate interim agreements on water sharing and employment, Ayanna explained. Federal agencies look favorably on communities that show they can cooperate on complex projects before requesting funding support. Thomas finally found his voice. You've been researching this for weeks. I've been researching this for months, Ayanna corrected. Since the first conflicts over water access made it clear that neither community could solve these problems independently. The admission revealed a level of preparation and strategic thinking that impressed even the skeptical council members. But it also raised questions about Ayanna's motivations and the extent of her involvement in tribal governance that Thomas was only beginning to understand. David, Two Bears leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Miss Crow Feather, you're proposing that we essentially merge our economic interests with a ranching operation that's been hostile to tribal concerns for 60 years. What makes you think this partnership would be different from previous attempts at cooperation that ended in exploitation and disappointment? The question struck at the heart of every tribal member's historical experience with white promises of mutual benefit. Thomas knew that his answer to this challenge would determine whether the evening's discussions led to genuine negotiation or polite rejection of proposals that sounded too risky to be trustworthy. But before he could respond, Ayanna spoke with quiet intensity that commanded attention from everyone in the room. Because this time the partnership would be legally binding, federally supervised, and structured to give tribal interests equal voice in all major decisions. We wouldn't be junior partners hoping for fair treatment. We'd be full partners with legal rights that couldn't be violated without federal consequences. She paused, her gaze moving around the room to include every council member in her assessment. And because Thomas Patterson is not his great-grandfather, his grandfather, or his father, he's a man who's seen what happens when different cultures try to coexist through dominance rather than partnership. He understands the cost of occupation and the value of genuine alliance. The reference to his military service created a moment of silence as council members considered the implications of her words. Thomas realized that Ayanna had been evaluating him not just as a potential partner, but as someone whose experiences might have taught him lessons that previous generations of Patterson men had never learned. Standing, Bear looked directly at Thomas. Is that assessment accurate, Mr. Patterson? Have your military experiences changed your understanding of how partnerships between different cultures should be structured? Thomas felt the weight of the moment, recognizing that his answer would determine not just the success of tonight's meeting, but the future of his family's ranch and his own relationship with the community he'd returned home to serve. Yes, he said simply. I've seen what happens when partnerships are based on inequality and fear. I've also seen what's possible when different communities work together based on mutual respect and shared interests. I'd rather build the second kind of relationship than repeat the mistakes that created the first. The silence that followed felt heavy with possibility and risk. Thomas had committed himself to partnerships that would fundamentally change how the ranch operated, while the council had to decide whether to trust Patterson with legal and economic arrangements that could either strengthen their community or create new vulnerabilities. Finally, Standing Bear spoke. The council will consider these proposals and provide our response within 1 week. In the meantime, the unauthorized dam will be removed and temporary water sharing arrangements will be implemented to ensure both communities have adequate access during the remainder of the drought season. As the meeting adjourned and people began filing out of the community center, Thomas found himself walking beside Ayanna toward the parking lot. The evening air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky above the mountains. "Thank you," he said, though the words felt inadequate for what she'd accomplished. "Those federal programs, you could have used that information to benefit your community without involving the ranch at all." Ayanna stopped beside her pickup truck, turning to face him with an expression that seemed to hold depths he was only beginning to understand. "Some problems are too big to solve alone, and some opportunities are too valuable to waste on half measures." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "Besides, there's something you need to know about those federal programs and why they're particularly important for this partnership." Thomas felt his chest tighten with anticipation. What kind of something? Something that will require more trust than we've built so far, and more commitment than you might be prepared to make. Ayanna's voice carried a seriousness that suggested whatever she was about to reveal would change everything about their negotiations. "Tell me, not here, where anyone might overhear. Meet me tomorrow night at the old cattle loading dock by the rail crossing. There are things about my family's history and the federal programs that you need to understand before this partnership goes any further." As she drove away into the darkness, Thomas remained in the parking lot, staring up at the stars and wondering what secret Ayanna was carrying that could affect their carefully constructed plans for cooperation and partnership. Tomorrow night, he would discover whether the trust they'd been building was strong enough to survive whatever truth she was prepared to share. The abandoned cattle loading dock stood like a monument to forgotten prosperity beside the railroad tracks that hadn't seen regular freight service in over a decade. Thomas arrived early, his truck headlights cutting through the darkness to illuminate weathered wooden platforms, where his grandfather had once shipped cattle to markets in Chicago and Denver. The skeletal remains of loading chutes and sorting pens stretched into shadows that seemed to hold the ghosts of more prosperous times. This place had been the economic heart of the valley during the ranch's peak years, when Patterson cattle were known throughout the region for their quality and the family name commanded respect in agricultural circles from Montana to Texas. Now it served mainly as a reminder of how quickly success could turn to struggle when markets shifted and communities failed to adapt to changing circumstances. Thomas shut off his engine and sat in the cab of his truck, listening to the sounds of night settling over the valley. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed off the mountains, though the tracks here had been abandoned to freight service that followed more profitable routes through larger population centers. The sound stirred memories of childhood, evenings when he'd sat on these same platforms with his father, watching trains pass and dreaming about the wider world beyond the valley's boundaries. Ayanna's headlights appeared on the access road 20 minutes later, her pickup navigating the rutted dirt path with the careful attention of someone familiar with the terrain's hidden obstacles. She parked beside his truck and emerged carrying a leather satchel that seemed heavy with documents or artifacts that required delicate handling. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice carrying unusual tension that suggested whatever she was about to reveal had been weighing on her mind for some time. "What I'm going to show you tonight changes everything about our partnership discussions. and I need to know that you're prepared to handle information that could affect both our families for generations." Thomas felt his chest tighten with familiar anxiety. Military service had taught him that the most dangerous moments often began with statements about classified information and need-to-know basis restrictions. How serious are we talking about? Serious. Enough that my grandfather made me promise never to reveal it unless circumstances made disclosure absolutely necessary for protecting our people. Ayana's expression was grave in the moonlight, filtering through high clouds. "I believe those circumstances have arrived." She opened her satchel and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents that appeared to be historical records, legal papers, and photographs dating back several decades. The careful way she handled the materials suggested they were both valuable and fragile, preserved through years of careful storage and limited access. "Thomas, what do you know about your great-grandfather's original land acquisition from the federal government?" The question seemed straightforward, though the setting and her serious tone suggested hidden complexities. Samuel Patterson purchased 12,000 acres from the Bureau of Land Management in 1923 through the Homestead Act provisions. He paid fair market value and received clear title that's been verified by every subsequent property transfer. "That's what the official records show," Ayana agreed, spreading several documents across the tailgate of her truck. "But official records don't always tell the complete story, especially when they involve transactions between federal agencies and local communities that lacked political representation." She pointed to a map that appeared to be a survey document from the 1920s, showing the boundaries of the Patterson Ranch overlaid with different markings in red ink. "This is the original survey commissioned by the Bureau of Land Management before your great-grandfather's purchase. The red lines show land that was identified as sacred sites and traditional hunting grounds that were supposed to be excluded from homestead sales." Thomas studied the map by flashlight, noting that the red-marked areas included some of the ranch's most valuable grazing land and water access points. If Ian's documents were accurate, his great-grandfather had purchased land that the federal government wasn't supposed to sell. "Are you saying the original sale was illegal?" "I'm saying the original sale violated federal agreements with the Blackfoot Nation that were supposed to protect sacred sites and traditional use areas," Ayana replied carefully. "Whether that makes it technically illegal depends on interpretations of treaty law that have never been tested in court." She withdrew another document, this one bearing official seals and signatures that appeared to be from Bureau of Indian Affairs correspondence. "This is a letter from the BIA supervisor in 1924, acknowledging that the Patterson land sale had been completed despite tribal objections that hadn't been properly addressed through consultation procedures." Thomas felt the ground shifting beneath his understanding of his family's history. Everything he'd been told about his great-grandfather's honorable acquisition of ranch land was being challenged by documents that suggested the purchase had been controversial from the beginning. Why didn't the tribal government challenge the sale when it happened? Because the tribal government in 1924 had no legal standing to challenge federal land transactions, Ayana explained with the patience of someone who'd spent years researching historical injustices. The Indian Citizenship Act had just been passed, but tribal sovereignty was barely recognized, and most government officials considered Indian objections to be minor obstacles that could be overcome through administrative procedures. The implications were staggering. If Ayana's documents were authentic, the Patterson Ranch had been built on land that should never have been sold, making every subsequent generation complicit in ongoing violations of federal agreements with the Blackfoot Nation. What happened to the tribal objections? They were filed and forgotten until my grandfather discovered them in BA archives during the 1970s when he was researching treaty violations for a legal case involving fishing rights. Ayana's voice carried the weight of long-held knowledge that had shaped her family's understanding of their relationship with neighboring ranchers. Joseph Crowfeather spent 2 years documenting the evidence, preparing to file a federal lawsuit that would have challenged the Patterson family's title to thousands of acres of ranch land. She paused, studying Thomas's face in the uncertain light. Then he met your grandfather Samuel, and everything changed. Thomas felt his world tilting as he realized the conversation was about to reveal information that would fundamentally alter his understanding of his family's relationship with the Blackfoot community. What do you mean everything changed? Ayanna withdrew a leather journal from her satchel, its pages yellow with age and filled with handwritten entries in both English and what appeared to be Blackfoot language. This is my grandfather's record of his meetings with Samuel Patterson between 1975 and 1977. Instead of filing the lawsuit, they negotiated a private agreement that resolved the land dispute through cooperation rather than litigation. She opened the journal to a page marked with a beaded bookmark, pointing to an entry dated September 15, 1976. Samuel Patterson acknowledged that his father's land purchase had violated federal agreements with the Blackfoot Nation. In exchange for Joseph Crowfeather agreeing not to file the lawsuit, Samuel committed to specific actions that would benefit the tribal community. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he read his grandfather's handwritten commitments. Annual payments equivalent to grazing lease fees for the disputed land, employment preferences for tribal members in ranch operations, access rights for traditional hunting and ceremony on designated portions of the property, and a binding agreement that the Patterson family would support tribal interests in future land use disputes with federal agencies. These commitments my father never told me about any of this, because your grandfather died in Korea before he could fully implement the agreement, and your father inherited a ranch without knowing about the private understanding that was supposed to govern its operations, Ayanna explained gently. Joseph Crowfeather chose not to enforce the agreement against James Patterson because he believed the son shouldn't be held responsible for promises he didn't know his father had made. The revelation explained so much about the tension Thomas had sensed in community relationships, the underlying hostility that seemed disproportionate to current disputes over water rights and boundary disagreements. His family had been operating for decades in violation of agreements that previous generations had considered binding and honorable. Why are you telling me this now? Because the federal partnership programs I mentioned to the tribal council require documentation of historical relationships between participating communities, Ayanna said, her voice carrying new urgency. If we apply for funding without addressing the unresolved land agreement, federal investigators will discover the documentary evidence during their background research. She gestured to the papers spread across her truck's tailgate. These documents would surface during the federal review process, creating legal complications that could destroy any possibility of partnership, while also exposing both our families to litigation that could take decades to resolve. Thomas felt the weight of inherited responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy pack. Military service had taught him about the burden of command decisions that affected other people's lives, but this was different, a legacy of obligations and commitments that stretched back through generations of family history he'd never fully understood. What would honoring the original agreement require? Implementation of the commitments your grandfather made, financial payments, employment preferences, access rights, and political support for tribal interests. Ayanna's tone was matter-of-fact, but Thomas could see the tension in her posture. As she waited for his response, the financial payments alone could bankrupt the ranch in its current condition, which is why the federal partnership program becomes essential, Ayanna replied. The grant funding would provide resources to honor historical commitments while building sustainable economic relationships that benefit both communities. Thomas studied the documents again, noting the careful way his grandfather had structured commitments that recognized tribal rights while preserving the ranch's viability. Samuel Patterson had been trying to create exactly the kind of partnership that Thomas and Ayanna were discussing, but his death had prevented the implementation of agreements that might have avoided decades of tension and mistrust. "There's something else," Ayanna said, withdrawing a final document from her satchel. "Your grandfather included a provision that if the Patterson family ever decided to sell the ranch, the Blackfoot Nation would have first right of refusal to purchase the disputed land at fair market value." The document was a deed restriction that had been filed with the county, but apparently never discussed with subsequent generations of Patterson family members. If enforced, it would give the tribal nation legal authority to block any sale of the ranch to outside buyers, while guaranteeing their opportunity to reclaim ancestral land if the Patterson family chose to abandon ranching. "You could use this to force us off the land entirely." "We could," Ayanna agreed. "But that would leave us with agricultural property we don't have the resources to operate effectively, while destroying economic relationships that benefit everyone in the valley. It would be legal revenge that creates new problems without solving underlying issues." Thomas appreciated her honesty about the leverage she held, recognizing that she was choosing cooperation over legal warfare, despite having weapons that could devastate his family's position. The decision to share this information rather than use it as a threat demonstrated the kind of character that made genuine partnership possible. "What you're proposing is essentially that we fulfill my grandfather's commitments through the federal partnership program. I'm proposing that we use federal resources to implement agreements that should have been honored decades ago, creating sustainable relationships instead of continuing patterns of conflict and mistrust that serve nobody's interests." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles, headlights cutting through the darkness from multiple directions. Thomas felt his military instincts sharpen as he counted at least 3 trucks converging on their location from different access roads. "Expecting company?" he asked, moving instinctively to position himself between Ayanna and the approaching vehicles. "No," she replied, her voice tight with concern. "And this location is too isolated for coincidental meetings." The first truck to arrive carried Bobby Ironcloud and several young tribal members, their expressions hostile, as they emerged from their vehicle with the aggressive energy that suggested they'd come prepared for confrontation. The second truck held ranch hands Thomas recognized from community meetings, including his foreman Jake Morrison and 2 seasonal workers who'd been vocal about their opposition to cooperation with tribal authorities. The third vehicle was Sheriff Morrison's patrol car, its emergency lights beginning to flash as it approached the loading dock. Thomas realized that someone had reported their meeting as suspicious activity, creating exactly the kind of public spectacle that could destroy any possibility of private negotiation. "Well, well," Bobby called out, his voice carrying across the distance between vehicles. "The Cowboy and the Indian princes having secret meetings to carve up our land rights without tribal approval." Jake Morrison stepped forward from the ranch hands group, his expression equally hostile. "Thomas, what the hell are you doing out here with her? Bad enough you're talking partnership with people who've been stealing our water, but secret meetings. Make it look like you're selling out your own people." Sheriff Morrison approached with the weary expression of a man who'd been called out to mediate conflicts he'd hoped were moving toward resolution. "Evening, folks. Got reports of suspicious activity out here. Mind explaining what's going on?" Thomas realized that the carefully constructed progress toward partnership was about to collapse under the weight of community suspicions and political pressures that neither he nor Ayanna had anticipated. The documents spread across her truck's tailgate contained information that could resolve historical disputes, but only if both communities trusted them enough to accept painful truths about the past. "Sheriff, we're discussing historical documents that affect land rights and partnership negotiations," Thomas said carefully, aware that every word would be reported back to various community factions. "Nothing secretive, just sensitive information that requires careful handling." Bobby laughed harshly, Sensitive information like how much of our land you're planning to keep when this partnership deal goes through. Or sensitive information like how much of the ranch you're planning to give away to buy peace with people who should be grateful for the jobs and opportunities we've already provided. Jake Morrison added. Ayanna stepped forward with quiet authority, her voice cutting through the escalating tensions. Everyone needs to understand that the information we're discussing tonight affects both communities' futures, and inflammatory accusations won't help anyone make informed decisions. Sheriff Morrison studied the documents visible on her truck's tailgate, his expression suggesting he recognized the potential significance of what he was seeing. These look like legal papers. You folks might want to consider having this conversation with lawyers present, especially if it involves property rights or historical agreements. As more vehicles arrived, word was spreading quickly through both communities about the confrontation at the loading dock. Thomas realized that the private revelation Ayanna had planned was becoming a public crisis that could destroy everything. They'd worked to build. The confrontation at the loading dock spiraled beyond anyone's control within minutes. What had begun as a private conversation about historical documents became a three-way shouting match between tribal members who felt betrayed by secret negotiations, ranch hands who believed their jobs were being bargained away, and community leaders who couldn't calm emotions that had been building for months. Thomas found himself in the impossible position of trying to explain agreements he'd learned about 20 minutes earlier to people who viewed any cooperation with the other side as fundamental betrayal. The historical documents Ayanna had revealed lay scattered across her truck's tailgate, vulnerable to damage from the increasingly aggressive crowd that surrounded them. You want to see what they're really planning? Bobby Ironcloud shouted, grabbing one of the BSA letters and waving it above his head. Secret deals to give away tribal land rights while pretending to negotiate in good faith with the council. Jake Morrison pushed forward from the ranch hands group, his face flushed with anger that had been building since news of partnership discussions first reached the ranching community. And you want to see what he's really planning? Selling out 4 generations of Patterson family legacy to buy peace with people who've been trying to steal our water. Sheriff Morrison stepped between the opposing groups, his hand resting on his radio as he prepared to call for backup from the state police. Everyone needs to step back and calm down before this situation gets completely out of hand. We're talking about land disputes and water rights, not worth fighting over. Easy for you to say, called out Maria Santos, a tribal council member who'd arrived with this second wave of vehicles. Your family doesn't have to live with the consequences of decisions made by people who think they can negotiate away our rights in parking lot meetings. The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. Thomas realized that his private discussions with Ayanna, however well-intentioned, had created exactly the kind of secretive appearance that fueled community suspicions about backroom deals and hidden agendas. Maria, we weren't negotiating away anyone's rights, Ayanna said firmly, though her voice was nearly drowned out by the competing arguments swirling around them. We were discussing historical information that affects how partnerships move forward, information that belongs to both communities, historical information that you've been hiding for decades while our family struggled with water shortages and economic hardship, Bobby shot back. How convenient that it surfaces now, just when the white rancher needs our cooperation to save his failing operation. The accusation was unfair but effective, casting Ayanna's revelation as manipulation rather than honest disclosure. Thomas could see doubt spreading through the tribal members present, suspicion that she was being used by Patterson family interests, just as previous generations of tribal negotiators had been exploited by white business leaders with superior resources and legal representation. From the ranch hand's perspective, the situation looked equally suspicious. Jake Morrison voiced their concerns with the blunt directness of someone who'd spent his career dealing with practical problems rather than political negotiations. Thomas, your father never mentioned any historical agreements with tribal authorities. and he kept detailed records of every business dealing for 30 years. Now this woman shows up with convenient documents that just happen to justify giving away ranch resources when we're already struggling to stay profitable. The suggestion that Ayanna's documents might be fabricated sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. Thomas knew the accusation was false. The papers bore official seals and signatures that would be easily verified, but the damage was done. Both communities were now questioning the authenticity of evidence that could fundamentally change their understanding of historical relationships. "Jake, those documents can be authenticated by federal archives," Thomas said, raising his voice to be heard over the escalating arguments. "The Bureau of Indian Affairs maintains records of all correspondence with tribal governments, and the county courthouse has copies of deed restrictions filed with property transfers." "Convenient answer," called out Danny Martinez, one of the seasonal ranch workers. Federal bureaucrats and tribal authorities working together to rewrite history when it serves their interests. "How do we know those documents weren't created last week to support this partnership deal?" The paranoia was spreading like wildfire, fed by decades of mistrust between communities that had learned to view each other's motives with suspicion. Thomas realized that rational discussion was becoming impossible as emotions overwhelmed evidence and political loyalties trumped objective analysis. The situation deteriorated further when Bobby Ironcloud made the tactical mistake of grabbing additional documents from Ayanna's truck, waving them above his head as evidence of conspiracy between Patterson family interests and tribal negotiators, who were supposedly selling out their people's rights for personal benefit. "Look at this," he shouted, holding up what appeared to be financial projections related to the federal partnership programs. "They've already worked out how to split the grant money, how much each side gets from tourism revenue, how to divide up resources that belong to our community." Jake Morrison pushed closer to examine the papers, his expression growing darker as he realized the scope of what was being discussed. $2 million in federal grants that required joint applications? Thomas, you're talking about legal partnerships that would give tribal authorities veto power over ranch operations. The revelation shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Ranch hands who'd been primarily concerned about job security suddenly understood that partnership agreements could fundamentally alter how the ranch operated, potentially giving tribal partners authority over decisions that had always been made by Patterson family members. "That's not how partnership agreements work," Thomas said, though he was beginning to doubt his own understanding of what he'd committed to during the tribal council meeting. "Shared decision-making doesn't mean tribal veto power over ranch operations." "Shared decision-making means exactly that," Maria Santos corrected sharply. "Federal partnership programs require consensus protocols that give each partner equal voice in major operational decisions. You can't access grant funding while maintaining unilateral control over how the money gets spent." Thomas felt the trap closing around him as he realized that his public statements about cooperation and partnership had committed him to arrangements he hadn't fully understood. The federal programs Ayanna had researched weren't simple funding sources. They were comprehensive partnerships that would transform the ranch from a family operation into something approaching a joint venture with tribal authorities. Sheriff Morrison was speaking urgently into his radio, calling for backup as the crowd continued to grow and tensions escalated beyond his ability to manage alone. More vehicles were arriving from both communities as news of the confrontation spread through networks of family and political relationships that connected everyone in the valley. "All right, that's enough." Ayanna's voice cut through the chaos, with surprising authority, commanding attention from both sides of the dispute. "Everyone here is arguing about agreements and documents and partnership terms, but nobody's talking about the real issue." She climbed onto the tailgate of her truck, using the elevation to address the entire crowd from a position where everyone could see and hear her clearly. The gesture was risky, making herself a visible target for hostile reactions, but it demonstrated the kind of courage that commanded respect even from her opponents. The real issue is whether our communities are going to continue fighting over resources that are shrinking every year, or whether we're going to work together to build something sustainable that benefits everyone, she continued, her voice carrying across the loading dock area. These historical documents matter because they show that previous generations understood what we're refusing to acknowledge, that our survival depends on cooperation, not conflict. Bobby started to interrupt, but Ayanna held up her hand with the kind of natural authority that had made her a respected voice in tribal politics, despite holding no official position. Bobby, you're angry about secret negotiations, and you have a right to be. Decisions that affect tribal interests should be made through proper consultation with elected representatives, not private conversations between individuals. She turned to include the ranch hands in her address. And Jake, you're worried about partnership agreements that could give outsiders control over ranch operations that have supported your families for generations. Thomas watched in amazement as Ayanna systematically addressed the concerns of both sides while building toward some kind of resolution that wasn't yet apparent. She was demonstrating exactly the kind of political leadership that successful partnerships would require, the ability to acknowledge competing interests while finding common ground that served everyone's essential needs. But fighting over these documents tonight won't resolve the underlying problems that brought us here, she continued. The creek is still running low. Economic opportunities are still limited. Young people are still leaving the valley because they can't build sustainable futures here. She gestured toward the abandoned loading dock and railroad infrastructure that surrounded them. This place used to be the economic heart of our entire community, tribal families and ranching. Families working together to ship cattle and agricultural products to markets across the country. It died because we stopped cooperating and started competing, because we let outside forces divide us instead of working together to adapt to changing circumstances. The historical reference was powerful because everyone present could remember when the loading dock had been active, when both communities had prospered through economic relationships that benefited everyone involved. The contrast with current circumstances was stark and undeniable. Thomas realized that Ayanna was creating an opportunity for him to address the crowd from a position of strength rather than defensiveness. She'd shifted the conversation away from accusations and suspicions toward shared recognition of problems that required collaborative solutions. Ayanna's right about the history and about the choice we're facing, he said, stepping forward to stand beside her truck. I came home from Afghanistan to find my family's ranch struggling with debt, water disputes, and community conflicts that were destroying relationships built over generations. He paused, studying the faces around him, people he'd grown up with, worked alongside, shared meals and celebrations and hardships with throughout his life. The documents Ayanna showed me tonight prove that my family has obligations to the tribal community that we haven't honored. But they also show that previous generations understood something we've forgotten, that our prosperity depends on working together, not fighting over limited resources. Jake Morrison stepped forward, his expression still skeptical, but no longer openly hostile. Thomas, what exactly are you proposing? Specific commitments, not general statements about cooperation. The question forced Thomas to make decisions about commitments that would affect every aspect of his family's future. Military training had taught him about the importance of clear objectives and defined mission parameters, but this situation required choices based on incomplete information and competing loyalties that couldn't be easily reconciled. I'm proposing that we implement the federal partnership program exactly as Ayanna outlined to the tribal council, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. Shared water management, employment preferences for tribal members, revenue sharing for tourism and hunting operations, and joint applications for federal funding that benefits both communities. The commitment was more specific than anything he'd said previously. and he could see the impact on faces throughout the crowd. Some expressions showed approval for concrete proposals that addressed their concerns. Others reflected worry about changes that might threaten established relationships and economic arrangements. And I'm proposing that we honor the historical agreements my grandfather made, including financial compensation for use of disputed land and access rights for traditional hunting and ceremony. Thomas continued, knowing that each word increased his legal and financial obligations, but recognizing that half measures would satisfy nobody. Bobby Ironcloud studied Thomas's face with the careful attention of someone trying to assess sincerity versus political calculation. Those are expensive commitments for a ranch that's already struggling financially. What makes you think you can afford to keep promises that your father couldn't make? Because keeping them is the only way to access federal funding that makes everything else possible, Thomas replied. And because not keeping them means continuing conflicts that will bankrupt the ranch and impoverish both communities. Sheriff Morrison had been monitoring the crowd's reactions, and he stepped forward as it became clear that the immediate crisis was moving toward resolution rather than escalation. Folks, it sounds like you've got some important decisions to make about partnership agreements and federal programs. But those decisions should be made through proper community processes, not parking lot confrontations. The suggestion provided face-saving exits for people on both sides, who were beginning to recognize that the evening's revelations required careful consideration rather than immediate reactions. The crowd began to disperse gradually, with small groups engaging in intense conversations about the implications of what they'd learned. As the loading dock area cleared, Thomas found himself alone with Ayanna beside her truck, surrounded by the scattered documents that had triggered the evening's crisis. The papers looked fragile in the uncertain light, vulnerable reminders of historical relationships that had shaped their communities in ways most people had never understood. That was either the beginning of something important or the end of everything we've worked toward, Ayanna said quietly, gathering the documents with careful attention to their preservation. Which do you think it was? Ayanna studied his face in the moonlight, her expression thoughtful as she considered the evening's events and their potential consequences. That depends on whether the promises you made tonight were tactical statements designed to diffuse a crisis or genuine commitments that you're prepared to honor regardless of the cost. Thomas felt the weight of her assessment, recognizing that everything they'd built toward partnership depended on his ability to prove that his words reflected actual intentions rather than political convenience. Tomorrow, both communities would be watching to see whether the commitments he'd made in public would be supported by actions that demonstrated genuine change in how the ranch operated. The test of their partnership was just beginning. The emergency joint session of the Tribal Council and Valley Ranchers Association took place in the high school gymnasium, the only space large enough to accommodate representatives from both communities, plus curious residents who'd heard rumors about federal partnership programs and historical land disputes. Thomas arrived 2 hours early to review his presentation materials one final time, knowing that this meeting would determine whether his public commitments at the loading dock could be transformed into workable agreements. The gymnasium bore the faded glory of small-town athletics championship banners from decades past, trophy cases celebrating victories in sports that had once unified a community now divided by cultural and economic tensions. Folding tables arranged in a large square dominated the basketball court, creating a neutral space where traditional adversaries could face each other as potential partners rather than opponents. Ayanna entered through the main doors carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of professional attire that marked her as someone moving between cultural worlds with practiced ease. She'd spent the week since the loading dock confrontation working with federal program administrators, tribal legal experts, and community leaders to develop proposals that addressed the specific concerns raised during that chaotic evening. Are you ready for this? she asked, settling into the chair beside Thomas at the table designated for partnership proponents. Because what we're about to propose will fundamentally change how both our communities operate, and there's no going back once federal agreements are signed. Thomas studied the faces around the room as community members filed in and found seats in the bleachers. Ranch families who'd known his father, tribal elders who remembered his grandfather, young people from both sides who saw this meeting as a test of their generation's ability to solve problems that had defeated their parents and grandparents. "I've been ready since I learned about my grandfather's unfulfilled commitments," he replied. "The question is whether everyone else is ready to choose cooperation over conflict." Chairman Standing Bear called the meeting to order with the formal procedures that marked official tribal government business, though the presence of ranching association representatives created diplomatic complications that required careful navigation. The chairman had spent his career managing relationships between tribal sovereignty and local economic interests, making him uniquely qualified to moderate discussions that would affect both communities for generations. "We're here tonight to consider proposals for federal partnership programs that could provide significant economic benefits while addressing historical disputes over land and water rights," Standing Bear began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing complex negotiations. "Before we examine specific terms, I want to acknowledge that these discussions are taking place because two individuals, Thomas Patterson and Ayanna Crowfeather, had the courage to share difficult truths about our shared history." The acknowledgement was diplomatically worded, but Thomas understood its significance. Standing Bear was giving official recognition to their private negotiations while establishing framework for community-wide consideration of proposals that had emerged from those conversations. The first item for discussion is implementation of federal agreements that were negotiated in the 1970s but never fully honored. Standing Bear continued, gesturing toward a display board where Ayanna had mounted photocopies of the historical documents discovered in her grandfather's records. These agreements established financial and operational commitments that the Patterson family made to resolve land disputes without litigation. Ranchers Association President Carl Henderson studied the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood that historical agreements could have contemporary legal implications. Chairman Standing Bear, "These look like private arrangements between individuals, not formal contracts that would be binding on subsequent property owners. Actually, they're deed restrictions that were filed with county property records," replied Tom Bradley, the elderly attorney who'd served both communities for decades. "I helped research the legal status after last week's revelations, and these commitments are binding on all future owners of the Patterson Ranch, regardless of whether they're family members." The clarification sent a ripple of surprise through the ranching representatives who'd assumed that historical agreements died with the people who made them. Learning that Thomas was legally obligated to honor his grandfather's commitments changed their understanding of what was being negotiated and why federal partnership programs had become essential for ranch survival. "What specific commitments are we talking about?" asked Sarah Mitchell, whose family operated the largest hay and feed operation in the valley. "Dollar amounts, employment numbers, access rights details that help us understand how these agreements would affect the broader ranching community." Ayanna opened her briefcase and distributed copies of financial projections she'd prepared. With assistance from federal program administrators, annual payments of $48,000 for use of disputed grazing land, employment preferences for tribal members representing 25% of ranch workforce, hunting, and ceremony access to designated areas during specified seasons, and political support for tribal interests in federal land use disputes. The numbers were significant but not catastrophic, representing commitments that a profitable ranch could honor without threatening its viability. But the Patterson Ranch hadn't been profitable for several years, making these obligations impossible. to meet without external funding sources that could stabilize operations while supporting historical agreements. 48,000 annually would bankrupt most ranching operations in the valley. Carl Henderson observed, "How is the Patterson Ranch supposed to honor commitments that none of us could afford?" Through federal partnership programs that provide grant funding and low-interest loans for cooperative agricultural ventures. Thomas replied, rising to address the assembled community representatives. The USDA Rural Development Program offers up to $2 million for projects that demonstrate environmental sustainability, community partnership, and economic development potential. He gestured toward a map showing the Patterson Ranch property, with overlay markings that indicated proposed partnership zones. Joint applications with the Blackfoot Nation would qualify for maximum funding levels while addressing water management, employment development, and tourism opportunities that benefit everyone in the valley. The scope of what he was proposing became clear as Thomas outlined specific project components: construction of modern cattle, handling facilities that would serve multiple ranching operations, development of cultural tourism programs that showcased both ranching heritage and tribal traditions, implementation of water conservation technologies that would stretch limited resources during drought years, and establishment of agricultural education programs that combine traditional ecological knowledge with contemporary farming techniques. "You're talking about transforming the Patterson Ranch into a regional agricultural center," said Mike Rodriguez, who managed one of the larger cattle operations in the adjacent valley. "Training facilities, tourist accommodations, educational programs. That's not ranching anymore. That's business development disguised as agriculture." The criticism struck at concerns shared by many traditional ranchers who viewed partnership programs as government interference in agricultural practices that had been successful for generations. Federal funding always came with regulations and oversight requirements that could complicate operations even when they provided financial benefits. Mike's right that these programs would change how ranching operations function, Thomas acknowledged. But they would also provide resources and opportunities that individual ranches can't access independently. Shared facilities, combined marketing, cooperative purchasing power advantages that help everyone compete in agricultural markets that increasingly favor large-scale operations. Bobby Ironcloud raised his hand from the tribal representative section. "What guarantees do we have that partnership benefits would actually reach tribal families instead of just creating jobs for ranch management and tourism development companies?" The question reflected concerns about previous economic development projects that had promised tribal benefits but delivered most opportunities to outside contractors and business interests. Federal programs often included tribal participation requirements that were satisfied through minimal compliance rather than meaningful partnership. Partnership agreements would include binding commitments for tribal hiring preferences, revenue sharing percentages, and shared decision-making authority, Ayana replied, distributing additional documents that outlined governance structures. For joint ventures, federal oversight ensures that tribal partners receive promised benefits, with penalty provisions for projects that fail to meet participation requirements. She pointed to specific sections of the partnership agreements that addressed Bobby's concerns. Tribal employment would be guaranteed at 30% of all positions, with training programs to ensure qualified candidates for specialized roles. Tourism revenue would be split equally between partners after operational expenses. Major decisions about land use, facility development, and program expansion would require consensus between ranch management and tribal representatives. The governance structure was more comprehensive than most attendees had expected, creating legal frameworks that would give tribal partners genuine authority over project direction rather than just advisory roles in decisions made by ranch management. Such arrangements represented fundamental changes in how agricultural partnerships operated, with implications that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Ranchers Association Vice President Linda Foster spoke up from her seat near the front of the room. These partnership agreements sound like they would give tribal authorities veto power over ranch operations. What happens when partners disagree about operational decisions or development priorities? The same thing that happens in any business partnership, Thomas replied. Disagreements get resolved through negotiation, compromise, and mutual respect for each partner's essential interests. And if partnership becomes unworkable, there are dissolution procedures that protect everyone's investments. Easier said than done when cultural values and economic priorities conflict, Linda countered. Tribal ceremonial requirements might conflict with cattle operation schedules. Tourism development might interfere with seasonal ranching activities. Traditional hunting practices might affect livestock management decisions. The concerns were legitimate, reflecting real operational challenges that would require ongoing communication and flexibility from all parties involved. Successful partnerships would depend on both sides' willingness to accommodate practices that might seem foreign or inconvenient, but were essential to their partner's cultural or economic needs. Chairman Standing Bear had been listening to the exchange with the careful attention of someone evaluating both the opportunities and risks involved in major community decisions. Mr. Patterson, Miss Crowfeather, these proposals represent significant changes for both our communities. Before we consider formal approval, I think we need to address the fundamental question of whether partnership actually serves our people's long-term interests. The challenge was direct and comprehensive, requiring Thomas and Ayanna to demonstrate that federal partnerships offer genuine benefits rather than just solutions to immediate financial problems. Community leaders needed to understand how cooperation would strengthen both sides rather than creating new dependencies that might prove problematic in future circumstances. Chairman Standing Bear, that's exactly the right question, Ayanna replied, standing to address the entire assembly. Partnership serves our interests because it creates sustainable economic relationships instead of continuing conflicts that impoverish everyone involved. She gestured toward the championship banners hanging from the gymnasium ceiling. This building represents what our communities accomplished when we worked together, shared investments in education, athletics, and social programs that benefited all families regardless of cultural background. Federal partnership programs offer opportunities to rebuild those cooperative relationships on economic foundations that support long-term prosperity. Thomas rose to stand beside her, recognizing that this moment would determine whether months of careful negotiation could produce agreements that served everyone's essential needs. The alternative to partnership is continuing the conflicts that have made both our communities poorer and weaker over the past 30 years. Water disputes that waste money on legal fees instead of conservation projects. Employment competition that divides qualified workers instead of developing training programs that benefit everyone. Economic isolation that makes us vulnerable to market changes that more cooperative communities can weather successfully. He paused, studying the faces around the room, people whose families had been shaped by generations of competition and cooperation, conflict and collaboration. Success and failure in relationships that had defined the Valley's character since its earliest settlement. Partnership isn't just about federal funding or historical agreements, Thomas continued. It's about choosing to build something sustainable that our children can inherit with pride, instead of leaving them conflicts that get worse with each passing generation. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of collective decision-making that would affect families and communities for decades to come. Federal partnership programs offered resources and opportunities that neither community could access independently, but they also required commitments and compromises that would fundamentally change how both sides operated. Chairman Standing Bear looked around the room, assessing the mood of representatives who would ultimately decide whether these proposals moved forward to formal approval processes. The Tribal Council will need to vote on these partnership agreements, and the Ranchers Association will need to decide whether to support applications that affect the entire valley's agricultural future. How long do we have to make these decisions? Asked Carl Henderson. Federal programs usually have application deadlines that don't wait for community consensus. Ayanna consulted her federal program documentation. Initial applications are due in 6 weeks, but projects can be developed over multiple funding cycles if communities need additional time to build support for comprehensive partnerships. 6 weeks to fundamentally reshape relationships that have been developing for over a century, Chairman Standing Bear observed. That's either ambitious timeline or completely unrealistic expectations. Thomas felt the weight of inherited responsibility settling on his shoulders as he realized that his family's financial survival and his community's economic future depended on decisions that would be made in the coming weeks. The federal partnership programs offered genuine opportunities for prosperity and cooperation, but only if both communities could overcome decades of mistrust and competing interests. Chairman Standing Bear, 6 weeks is enough time to decide whether we're committed to cooperation or whether we prefer the conflicts that have brought us to this crisis point, Thomas said. The programs and funding will be available for communities that are ready to work together. The question is whether we're one of those communities. As the meeting adjourned and people began filing out of the gymnasium, Thomas remained at the partnership table with Ayanna, surrounded by documents that represented either the foundation for lasting cooperation or elaborate plans that would never be implemented because community support couldn't be sustained through the federal application process. "Do you think we convinced them?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would depend on private conversations and community meetings that would take place over the following weeks. "We convinced them that partnership is possible," Ayanna replied, gathering her materials with the careful attention of someone who understood that documents could be weapons or tools, depending on how they were used. Whether they choose to embrace that possibility depends on whether both sides are more afraid of change or more afraid of continuing the conflicts that brought us here. Tomorrow, Thomas would discover whether his public commitments to partnership could survive the private pressures and political calculations that would ultimately determine his family ranch's survival and his community's willingness to choose cooperation over perpetual conflict. 3 weeks before the federal application deadline, Thomas found himself standing on the porch of the main ranch house at sunrise, watching tribal work crews install solar panels on the barn roof while ranch hands repaired fence lines that would soon mark boundaries of shared grazing areas. The partnership agreement had been approved by both communities, but implementation was revealing practical challenges that formal documents hadn't anticipated. The integration wasn't going smoothly. Cultural differences in work schedules, communication styles, and decision-making processes were creating daily friction between employees who were supposed to be building cooperative relationships. Tribal workers arrived for morning shifts according to traditional sunrise timing that didn't align with ranch schedules based on livestock feeding requirements. Ranch hands accustomed to hierarchical management structures struggled with consensus-based decision-making that tribal culture required for major operational choices. "We've got another problem," Jake Morrison announced, climbing the porch steps, with the expression of a man delivering bad news he'd rather avoid. "The federal inspectors are coming next week to evaluate our partnership implementation, and Bobby Ironcloud is threatening to file complaints about cultural discrimination in work assignments." Thomas felt his chest tighten with familiar anxiety. Military service had taught him that successful operations required careful coordination between diverse groups, but ranch partnerships were proving more complex than joint operations with Afghan tribal militias. At least in Afghanistan, everyone understood they were fighting common enemies. Here, success depended on people choosing cooperation despite historical reasons to distrust each other's motives. What kind of cultural discrimination Bobby claims that tribal workers are being assigned manual labor, while ranch hands get supervisory positions and equipment operation responsibilities. Jake explained with obvious frustration. He's saying the partnership agreement promised equal opportunities, but actual implementation maintains white authority over tribal labor. The accusation was serious because federal partnership programs included strict anti-discrimination provisions that could result in funding cancellation if violations were documented. More importantly, the charge contained enough truth to be politically damaging, even if legally defensible. Ranch hands did hold most supervisory positions because they had years of experience with specific operations, but the arrangement looked like racial hierarchy to outside observers. Have you talked to Iana about this? That's the other problem, Jake said, his expression growing darker. She's been spending more time in consultation with tribal elders about traditional ecological practices than working with ranch management on operational integration. Bobby's claiming she's been co-opted by Patterson family interests and lost sight of tribal priorities. Thomas realized that the political pressures affecting partnership implementation were threatening to destroy relationships that had taken months to build. Iana was being attacked from within her own community for cooperating too closely with ranch interests, while he was facing criticism from ranching families who believed he was giving away too much authority to tribal partners. The situation deteriorated further when Sheriff Morrison arrived with news that someone had filed formal complaints with the Bureau of Indian Affairs about violations of tribal sovereignty in partnership operations. Federal investigators would be reviewing all aspects of the joint venture to ensure compliance with regulations governing tribal partnerships with non-native agricultural operations. The complaints are anonymous, but they're detailed enough to suggest inside knowledge of operational procedures, Sheriff Morrison explained during their conversation in the ranch office. Someone with access to partnership documents and daily operational reports is providing information to federal investigators. Thomas studied the complaint summaries the sheriff had shared, recognizing administrative language that suggested the source was familiar with both tribal governance procedures and federal regulatory requirements. The accusations were carefully crafted to highlight potential violations while avoiding claims that could be easily disproven through documentation. This looks like someone trying to destroy the partnership without taking responsibility for the consequences, Thomas observed. Detailed enough to trigger federal investigation, but vague enough to avoid accountability for false accusations. That's my assessment too, Sheriff Morrison agreed. But the federal investigators won't care about motivations. They'll focus on whether partnership operations comply with regulations. And some of these complaints identify genuine problems that need to be addressed. The timing couldn't have been worse. Federal funding disbursement was scheduled to begin within 2 weeks, but bureaucratic investigations could delay or cancel payments that both communities were counting on for operational expansion and economic development. Partnership projects that had been planned for months would be put on hold while investigators evaluated compliance with regulations that were often contradictory and always complex. That afternoon, Thomas drove to the tribal community center, hoping to find Iana and discuss strategies for addressing the federal complaints before they undermined everything they'd worked to build. Instead, he found her in the parking lot loading boxes into her pickup truck with the kind of systematic efficiency that suggested she was leaving for an extended period. Going somewhere? He asked, though her expression suggested the answer would be disappointing. Denver. The tribal legal department needs consultation on federal partnership regulations, and the National Congress of American Indians wants me to present our cooperation model at their annual conference. Iana's tone was professional but distant, lacking the warmth that had characterized their recent conversations about partnership implementation. How long will you be gone? 2 weeks minimum, possibly longer depending on how the federal investigation develops and whether other tribal nations want detailed information about our partnership structure. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest as he realized that Ayanna was distancing herself from the ranch partnership at exactly the moment when her leadership and cultural expertise were most essential for addressing community conflicts and federal compliance issues. Ayanna, we need you here. The integration problems, the federal complaints, the inspection next week. We can't navigate this successfully without your involvement. Thomas, I've been thinking about our partnership and the commitments we've made, and I'm not sure they're sustainable in the long term. Her words were delivered with careful precision that suggested she'd been rehearsing this conversation. The cultural differences are more significant than we anticipated, and the political pressures are affecting my standing within the tribal community. The admission hit him like a physical blow. Everything they'd built together, the trust, the cooperation, the shared vision for community development, was apparently more fragile than he'd understood. Federal investigations and community politics were fracturing relationships that had seemed strong enough to withstand external pressures. What are you saying exactly? I'm saying that maybe Bobby and the other critics are right about partnerships between tribal nations and white ranching operations. Historical patterns of exploitation are difficult to overcome, and even well-intentioned cooperation can reproduce power imbalances that disadvantage tribal interests. Thomas stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman who'd spent months developing comprehensive partnership proposals with someone who was now questioning the fundamental viability of everything they'd worked to create. So you're walking away? Just when the partnership faces its first serious challenges, you're deciding it was a mistake from the beginning? I'm taking time to evaluate whether continuing the partnership serves tribal interests or just creates new forms of dependency that benefit ranch operations more than tribal families, Ayanna replied. Though her voice carried less conviction than her words suggested, Thomas realized that this conversation was about more than partnership logistics or federal compliance issues. Something fundamental had shifted in Ayanna's assessment of their relationship and the possibilities for cooperation that had brought them together. This isn't about federal investigations or community politics, he said quietly. This is about U.S., isn't it? About whether you trust me enough to build something together, despite the obstacles we're facing. Ayanna's composure cracked slightly, revealing emotions she'd been working to control. Thomas, what we've built is important and valuable, but it's also complicated in ways that extend beyond business partnerships or community cooperation. Complicated how? Complicated because I care about you in ways that affect my judgment about what's best for my people, she said with the kind of honesty that made her vulnerable while clarifying everything that had been unspoken between them. And because caring about you makes me question whether I'm advocating for tribal interests or for relationships that matter to me personally. The admission changed everything about their conversation. Thomas realized that Ayanna wasn't just questioning the partnership's viability. She was struggling with the conflict between personal feelings and political responsibilities that made objective decision-making nearly impossible. Ayanna, caring about someone doesn't compromise your integrity unless you let it override your principles, he said, stepping closer to her truck where she was still loading boxes with nervous energy. And your principles have been clear from the beginning. You want what's best for your community, and you're willing to work for it even when it's difficult. But what if what's best for my community conflicts with what I want personally? What if the partnership succeeds, but creates dependencies that compromise tribal sovereignty? What if caring about you makes me willing to accept arrangements that my grandfather would have rejected as another form of colonial exploitation? Thomas felt the weight of her dilemma, understanding that she was facing choices between loyalty and opportunity, tradition and innovation, personal happiness and political responsibility. The federal partnership programs offered genuine benefits, but they also required compromises that could be interpreted as betrayal of tribal independence. What would your grandfather think about partnerships that give tribal nations equal authority? And shared benefits instead of junior status in arrangements controlled by white interests? Ayanna considered the question seriously, her expression thoughtful as she weighed historical experience against contemporary possibilities. He would evaluate them based on results rather than intentions, on whether tribal families actually benefited rather than whether partnerships looked equitable on paper. And what results would convince him that our partnership serves tribal interests? Economic opportunities that didn't exist before. Educational programs that strengthened rather than diluted tribal culture. Land management practices that honored traditional ecological knowledge. Political relationships that enhanced rather than compromised tribal sovereignty. Thomas recognized that she was outlining criteria for successful partnerships that addressed the deepest concerns within tribal communities about cooperation with non-native institutions. Meeting those standards would require sustained commitment to shared authority and cultural respect that went far beyond federal compliance requirements. All of those results are possible if we work together, but they're impossible if community politics and federal investigations destroy the relationships. We need to implement partnership agreements effectively. Thomas, I want to believe that's true, but I also know that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes, especially when power imbalances and cultural differences create opportunities for misunderstanding and exploitation. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Bobby Ironcloud and two tribal council members, their expression suggesting they'd come to discuss serious community business that didn't welcome outside participation. Thomas recognized the dynamic from military operations where coalition partners needed private consultation before joint activities could proceed. Ayanna, the council needs to speak with you about the federal investigation and your role in partnership negotiations. Bobby announced, his tone carrying official authority that made Thomas's presence clearly unwelcome. Of course, Ayanna replied, though Thomas could see reluctance in her posture as she prepared to engage with political pressures that were pulling her away from cooperative relationships toward more traditional approaches to tribal self-determination. As the tribal representatives moved toward the community center for private discussions, Thomas realized that his window for preserving the partnership and his relationship with Ayanna was closing rapidly. Federal investigations, community politics, and cultural conflicts were combining to destroy everything they'd worked to build, but military service had also taught him about the importance of decisive action when circumstances required bold choices that couldn't be delayed for optimal timing or perfect conditions. Sometimes survival depended on committing completely to courses of action that carried significant risks, but offered the only realistic possibilities for success. Ayanna, wait, he called out, stopping her before she reached the community center entrance. Before you make final decisions about the partnership or your role in it, I want you to know something that might affect your assessment of what we're building together. She turned back toward him, clearly torn between personal curiosity and political obligations that required her attention. Thomas, whatever you want to discuss can wait until the federal investigation is resolved and the council has made decisions about partnership continuation. No, it can't wait, because what I want to discuss is directly related to those decisions and their implications for both our communities. He took a deep breath, recognizing that he was about to make commitments that would fundamentally change his life, regardless of their outcome. I'm asking you to marry me. The proposal hung in the air between them, shocking in its timing and context, but also logical as a solution to problems that were threatening to destroy everything they'd worked to build. Marriage would demonstrate permanent commitment to partnership that went beyond business arrangements or federal funding cycles. Thomas, this isn't the time or place for personal decisions. This isn't just a personal decision, he interrupted gently. It's a political statement about the kind of future we want to build together. A demonstration that cooperation between our communities can create lasting relationships instead of temporary arrangements that collapse when challenges arise. Bobby, and the council members had stopped walking, clearly surprised by a proposal that transformed private negotiations into public declarations with implications for tribal politics and community relationships. "You're proposing marriage as a solution to partnership problems?" Ayanna asked, her voice carrying disbelief that was mixed with something that might have been hope. "I'm proposing marriage because I love you and because our relationship represents the kind of bridge between communities that makes lasting cooperation possible," Thomas replied, aware that every word was being evaluated for political implications, as well as personal sincerity. "And because partnerships based on legal agreements and federal funding are vulnerable to political pressures and bureaucratic changes, but partnerships based on family relationships and shared commitment have foundations that can weather any crisis." As he knelt on one knee in the community center parking lot, producing the engagement ring he'd been carrying for weeks while waiting for the right moment that had never seemed to arrive, Thomas realized that he was gambling everything his family's ranch, his relationship with Ayanna, and both communities' economic future on the possibility that love could bridge differences that politics and business arrangements had failed to reconcile. 6 months later, the wedding ceremony took place on the exact spot where Clearwater Creek had once been divided by Bobby Ironclad's unauthorized dam. The creek now flowed freely through a series of carefully engineered channels that provided water access for both ranch cattle and tribal families, while supporting the restoration of native fish populations that had been decimated by decades of environmental degradation. Thomas stood beneath an arbor, constructed from materials that symbolized the union they were celebrating. Ranch timber paired with traditional Blackfoot lodge poles, decorated with wildflowers from tribal lands and cattle brands that had marked Patterson family livestock for 4 generations. His dress uniform bore combat ribbons from Afghanistan alongside a traditional Blackfoot eagle feather that Ayanna's grandfather had carried during his own military service in Vietnam. The guest list reflected communities that had been transformed by a partnership nobody had believed possible a year earlier. Federal investigators sat beside tribal elders who'd initially opposed cooperation with white ranching interests. Ranch families shared tables with Blackfoot families who'd learned that cultural preservation could coexist with economic development. Bobby Ironclad served as an usher, his hostility transformed into grudging respect for results that had exceeded everyone's expectations. Chairman Standing Bear officiated the ceremony, his words carefully chosen to honor both Christian traditions that Thomas had grown up with and Blackfoot spiritual practices that connected Ayanna to generations of ancestors who'd lived on this land before European settlement. The marriage wasn't just the union of 2 individuals. It was a public commitment to the kind of cultural bridge building that had made their partnership successful despite obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. Ayanna approached through an honor guard of tribal women, wearing traditional dress, and ranch women in their finest Western attire, the visual representation of communities that had learned to celebrate shared achievements rather than competing for limited recognition. Her wedding dress combined contemporary elegance with traditional beadwork that told the story of families whose survival had depended on adaptation without abandonment of cultural identity. "Thomas Patterson," she said as they exchanged vows that had been crafted to reflect their unique journey from conflict to cooperation. "You offered me partnership when I needed a home, and you gave me love when I needed hope. Today I promise to build with you a future that honors both our peoples while creating something new that belongs to our children and their children." Thomas felt the weight of inherited responsibility transform into shared opportunity as he spoke his own vows. "Ayanna Crowfeather, you taught me that true strength comes from cooperation, not dominance, and that the best legacy we can leave is relationships built on respect rather than conquest. I promise to honor your culture, support your dreams, and work beside you to heal wounds that previous generations thought were permanent." The rings they exchanged had been forged from silver mined on tribal lands and gold from mining claims that ranch families had worked for decades, metals combined, by a local artisan whose own heritage included both Blackfoot and European ancestry. Each ring bore engravings in both English and Blackfoot that promised partnership, respect, and commitment to shared prosperity. Sheriff Morrison read a proclamation from the governor recognizing the Patterson-Crow-Feather Partnership as a model for rural economic development that strengthened communities through cooperation rather than federal intervention. The state agricultural department had featured their joint venture in promotional materials, encouraging similar partnerships throughout the region, but the most meaningful recognition came from federal program administrators who'd investigated the anonymous complaints and discovered not violations, but innovations that exceeded compliance requirements. The partnership had become a showcase for successful integration of traditional ecological knowledge with contemporary ranching techniques, generating outcomes that benefited both environmental conservation and agricultural productivity. Dr. Sarah Chun, the federal liaison for tribal partnership programs, spoke during the reception about results that had impressed even skeptical bureaucrats. The Patterson-Crow-Feather venture has achieved 28% higher cattle productivity per acre while reducing water consumption by 18% and increasing native plant diversity by 43%. Traditional grazing rotation patterns combined with modern range management have created a model that other partnerships are requesting to study and replicate. The economic results were equally impressive. Tourism revenue from cultural and educational programs had exceeded projections by 60%, with visitors coming from universities, agricultural organizations, and tribal nations across the country to observe successful cooperation between communities that had historically struggled with resource conflicts. Employment had expanded beyond initial commitments, with tribal members filling 38% of ranch positions, including supervisory roles that had been created to manage partnership programs. Young people who'd planned to leave the valley for urban opportunities were instead enrolling in agricultural education programs that prepared them for careers that honored both traditional knowledge and contemporary innovation. Bobby Ironcloud approached Thomas during the reception, his expression serious but no longer hostile. "I owe you an apology," he said with the directness that had characterized his opposition to partnership arrangements. "I thought cooperation with your family meant tribal surrender to white interests. But watching how you and Ayanna have built something that strengthens both communities, I was wrong about what partnership could accomplish." The admission was particularly meaningful because Bobby had become one of the partnership's most effective advocates after seeing results that addressed tribal concerns about economic exploitation and cultural dilution. His change of heart had influenced other young tribal members who'd viewed cooperation as betrayal of ancestral resistance to colonial domination. "Bobby, your skepticism kept us honest about tribal interests and pushed us to prove that cooperation could deliver real benefits rather than empty promises," Thomas replied. "Opposition that demands accountability makes partnerships stronger, not weaker." As evening settled over the celebration, Thomas and Ayanna stood together beside Clearwater Creek, watching the water flow freely through channels that symbolized their success in removing barriers that had divided communities for generations. The creek's restoration had been completed using traditional ecological knowledge combined with modern engineering, creating habitat that supported both agricultural needs and cultural practices. "Any regrets?" Ayanna asked, echoing the question that had become their private ritual for assessing major decisions. "Only that my grandfather didn't live to see what partnership could accomplish when it's based on genuine respect rather than political convenience," Thomas replied. "He would have been proud of what we've built together. And my grandfather would have said that the best marriages are like successful hunting partnerships. They require different skills working toward shared goals, with each partner trusting the other to contribute what they do best. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of federal program representatives who'd traveled from Washington to observe partnership operations that had become a model for rural development initiatives throughout the country. Congressional staff members were preparing legislation that would expand funding for similar ventures, based on documented success in communities that had previously been written off as economic dead ends. "Mr. and Mrs. Patterson," said Rebecca Martinez, the USDA Deputy Administrator for Rural Partnerships, "your project has generated enough positive data to justify a new funding category for tribal agricultural cooperation. We'd like to discuss your availability for consulting with other communities that want to replicate your model." The opportunity was significant, but would require travel and consultation responsibilities that could affect ranch operations and family life. Thomas and Ayanna exchanged glances that reflected months of experience making decisions together about opportunities that carried both promise and complexity. "We'd be honored to share what we've learned," Ayanna replied, "but our first responsibility is to the communities and partnerships we've already committed to building here. Any consulting work would need to strengthen rather than compete with local relationships." As the celebration continued into the night, Thomas realized that their marriage represented more than personal happiness or political alliance. It symbolized the possibility that communities could choose cooperation over conflict, that historical wounds could heal without forgetting important lessons, and that love could bridge differences that politics alone couldn't reconcile. The partnership they'd built had saved his family's ranch while strengthening tribal sovereignty. Their marriage had created relationships that would influence both communities for generations. Most importantly, they'd proven that the future could be different from the past when people chose hope over fear and then partnership over isolation. Under the Montana stars, beside the creek that had once divided their peoples, Thomas and Ayanna began their married life knowing that they'd already accomplished the most important work, building trust strong enough to weather any storm and love deep enough to sustain the partnerships that would shape their children's inheritance. The feud was over, the partnership had begun, and the best was yet to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.